everyone, and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players of the gigging variety. My name is David Holloway, and it's wonderful to be here with you as always. I'm flying solo again today. Mr. Paul Bindig is having a much-deserved holiday. Hope you're still enjoying sipping those cocktails, Paul, and look forward to seeing you back soon. I'm really excited today to introduce our guest, Mr. Dave Weiser. Now, this is a little bit of a different interview in that Dave has had an amazing experience in doing sound programming and design for some of the best musical productions in the world. So whether it's West End, Broadway, whatever the top tier theatre district is in your country, he's likely to have had some involvement with it. And that's let alone the fact that Dave worked for Kurzweil Systems for 13 years, still consults to them, and is an amazing, font of knowledge around everything Kurzweil. So I think you'll enjoy this one. Oh, and I did forget to mention he's worked with a few minor names such as sort of Roger Waters and Brian Wilson and David Bowie. You may have heard of a couple of those. So it was lovely to talk to Dave, and I think you'll enjoy this interview a great deal, and I'll see you after the show. Dave, can't thank you enough for joining us, and it's been a bit of a pattern on this show the last couple of months. It's a Friday night show for our guests, so giving up a Friday night is much appreciated.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I'm a big fan of the show.
No, thank you. And I thought we'd mix it up a little bit this episode. I thought we'd work from the present and go backwards. So in the introduction, I've given a bit of an overview of your work, Dave, but let's talk about what are you working on right now?
Right now, unlikely as it might have sounded a couple years ago, I'm working on a children's book. My second one, a follow-up. This one's called The Girl Who Wanted to Rock, and the first one was called The Boy Who Wanted to Rock, which I wrote for my son.
And yeah, so what? Yeah, so it was for your son. So what? Obviously, to go from working in music and sound design to actually writing the book, what gave you the prompt to actually do that for real?
The origin of the first book, The Boy Who Wanted to Rock, it was 2019, and I was working on a theater show, and it was one of those times where I was in a rehearsal room. Everyone was in a different language. I was the only American there. Everyone was speaking German, and it would have been perceived as a little impolite if I had sat there the whole time on my laptop or on my phone. You can check occasionally, and that's not a thing, but to just have your nose in a piece of electronics would have been deemed rude. But on the other hand, if you're there with a notebook, writing in a notebook, it just looks like you're taking copious notes, and it looks great. And so I thought, I had been thinking about while at home reading books with my son, I had thought a couple times, gosh, maybe I could do this. I how many times do we say, oh, I could do that? And so I pulled out my notebook while I was in this boring rehearsal under fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs, and I just said, you know what? Just get something on the paper. Just get something down on the page, and it can be terrible, it can suck, and I can throw it away later, or I can edit it later, but the thing that got into my head, the thing that spurred me was just get something down on the page. And that's what I did. That's where it came from.
And so, obviously, by the title, The Boy Who Wanted to Rock and now The Girl Who Wanted to Rock, it has a music link. So how did you work that in? And without giving away too much, and we'll link to the books, what's the rough sort of storyline?
The little boy it's based on my son Arlen, and he has this huge love of music. He always has, ever since he was a real little guy, and he has an equally big desire for immediate results. And so this would result in big frustrations when he first approached guitar, when he first approached keyboards, when he couldn't execute what he was hearing in his head. And so the book and some other things along with the book, just little games that I play with him, but the book comes from trying to console him, trying to ease that frustration and let him know that there are ways that music can give back. A lot of times music's very unforgiving when a kid is first learning it, and so the book was my clumsy attempt at sort of finding something that gave back a little bit. Now, of course, after 3 years, he's like, yeah. Enough about the book, Dad. I've heard about the book. I said, no more. Again with the book, you know.
But that, which is so great. And what's the response been like, Dave? Like, I haven't actually looked into it. You selling it yourself online or via distributors or?
There's a company here called Book Baby that it's a bit like their sister company is called CD Baby, if you're familiar with them, and so with Book Baby they handle all the back end. They handle the inventory, printing, publishing, and distribution, and so it's selling on Amazon. It's selling on all the big sites. It's on several booksellers in Australia. But yeah, it's not having a basement full of books, not having inventory means I get to stay married. So that's
Right.
a very important component. That was the key component, was not having to keep inventory here.
And I think a lot of our listeners probably have boxes of CDs or vinyl in their basement from their own projects. I think we sympathise.
Oh yeah. I've got. I was just, as I was plugging in up here tonight, I ran into some old CDs from bands back in the '90s when I used to be a bit skinnier, and
Weren't we all? Weren't we all?
and they're still kicking around.
So you mentioned sitting in an uncomfortable chair in a fluorescent rehearsal studio, and it sounds like that was in Germany, if most people were speaking German. So tell us about, let's talk about musicals and you know, where you've gotten to with that, working again from the future back. So, you know, what are you doing now versus 20 years ago that is really making a living for you in that area?
I work with a partner named Stuart Andrews, and together he and I do all or most of the keyboard programming for all the Andrew Lloyd Webber shows and all the Cameron Mackintosh shows around the world, which is a lot of shows. You know, Phantom runs in New York, but there's also an Asia tour, and there's one in Greece right now, and there's usually one in Korea, and there's usually one in Japan. And so he or I, either one of us, will go to the location, to the theater. We'll work there for about a month, get things up and running, coach the players on how to play the parts, work with the orchestrator, work with the music supervisor to make little adjustments. In a rehearsal, they may need to add 4 bars of music for a dance thing. And so that needs to be programmed on the fly in the middle of rehearsal. And so when my partner picked me up to work with him, he needed a guy who was really fast on programming Kurzweils. That's sort of how I got the gig, was that I can whip up programming really quickly on a Kurzweil.
So let's dig into that a bit deeper. So let's talk about the Lloyd Webber ones, because, I mean, I'm absolutely aware of Cameron Mackintosh, and Phantom is a huge musical. But let's talk about Lloyd Webber for now. Given the worldwide footprint of Lloyd Webber musicals, is there sort of any central coordination of the type of instruments used? So what I'm getting at is, are you walking in to a gig in Asia or Europe and the rigs are totally different, or is there some coordination of what instruments are being used?
It's mostly the latter. There's a great deal of coordination where we work with an orchestrator and with Webber himself. Webber is very closely involved, and most of the sounds are approved by Webber. Most of the sounds get reused again on the various productions. He likes a certain celeste. He likes a certain viola sample. He likes a certain bassoon, and they end up showing up. Now, the exact details of the programming of what occurs on each page of music is going to vary from country to country, production to production, because of the bar lengths or extra little, you know, a couple extra bars being inserted here or there, or they might have a slightly different version of one scene in Japan versus Korea versus Hungary. So there is not one. It would be so easy if there were just one central file that I could show up and I could use it for all the shows. The The other thing that I didn't realize before joining on with this effort in this organization is that these shows are living things, that they're organisms that grow over time. And so we'll be playing a show like Jesus Christ Superstar, and people will say, "Oh, the vintage key sound, the mini Moogs and the Hammond organs, isn't it great?" And I say, yeah, there is some of that stuff there, but they've been doing Jesus Christ Superstar all through the 70s, all through the 80s, all through the early 90s. And in the early 90s, they added a lot of DX7 electric pianos, for example. And they've slowly been starting to take those out now again and go back to more of a vintage sound. But these shows are living, breathing organisms that change and evolve, and they pick up little pieces as they roll forward.
And I think Jesus Christ Superstar is a great example. And I'm biased here, Dave, because many years ago I had the pleasure of playing, the synthesizer role in a production of that. So
Nice.
I sort of know the score quite well. So you turn up to a JC Superstar gig somewhere in the world. Are they tending to use the same brands of gear? So obviously we'll talk about your involvement with Kurzweil. Is Kurzweil one of the dominant brands there, or there does tend to be a mix of gear and you're essentially programming, sometimes loading samples, sampled sounds or whatever? How's that work?
Our rigs are always the same, everywhere in the world. Now, sometimes we have to update them to newer equipment. We're right now in the middle of updating and adopting the K2700. Up until recently, it's been PC3K, and it's been that way since about 2010, which I joined in 2012. But they've been using the PC3K since around 2009 or 2010. The PC3K was actually invented. It was created for Webber because their old 2600s were running out of steam and they couldn't find replacements and they couldn't find repair parts. And so that's how I met my now partner. Was they sent him over to Kurzweil R&D where I used to work, and he and I became drinking buddies, really, is the truth of the matter. But I was his designated handler. So the rigs are the same. We use a Kurzweil keyboard as the brains. That's where the patch list resides. That's where the pedal control resides. Volume pedals, patch change pedals, all that stuff is done from the keyboard. And the reason for that, we also use a laptop. We use a laptop, an RME interface. On the laptop, we run Motu Mach 5. No program changes sent to it. It just has 16 channels of samples mapped out across, however many octaves of. I think their each channel has like 9 octaves you can cram samples into. But we're very risk averse, so every piece of gear in the rig is chosen for stability in addition to sound quality.
So without being too simplistic, Dave, but and again, just talking about Lloyd Webber, because he likes particular Celeste sounds, whatever the sounds are, he nearly, I'm not saying it's a mandate, but he nearly basically enforces his productions. If you're going to run them in a country, it'll be Kurzweil keyboards with a particular approach and particular sounds.
Oh, yes. Yeah. We send a gear list ahead of time with no substitutions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
It has to be RME interfaces. It has to be the Kurzweil keyboard. It has to be whatever it is we've listed. Each keyboard rig has a pair of Genelec speakers behind the player, behind at head level, and then another pair of Genelec speakers at their feet facing outward. And the point of that is that the pit is all acoustic. We don't use in-ear monitors. Every keyboard rig is generating the same amount of decibels that a cello, that a string section would be, or a brass section would be generating.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it totally makes sense, right? I get that. That
was Webber's idea too. Those of us who work on the shows, when that first came up, we were a bit skeptical that, oh God, really? but in to our surprise, and it is a treat. It really works, and it sounds amazing to sit in the front couple of rows in a theater and hear the massive sound wafting out of the pit. That's not just coming through the sound system. That's one of the biggest differences between our programming and the way other shows are programmed.
And I think we've mentioned it before on the show, and apologies to listeners and viewers that have been to many musicals or even played in orchestra pits, but it was a real revelation to me the first time I played in an orchestra pit, the power that an orchestra can put out. I was totally ignorant. So what you're saying about the sound washing over you is just the power of an orchestra is incredible.
Oh yeah, one of the most fun things I get to do sometimes is I get to sit in the pit with my little notebook, not writing kids' stories, actually taking notes, and just observing what's happening in the pit, and to be right in the midst of it. It's like magic. It's such a treat. It never gets old.
And I just realised one of my fondest memories, Dave, is in the JC Superstar Land, and I think it's that the string instrumental break in the middle of I Don't Know How to Love Him, where all the strings are not playing in unison but playing together, and no synth line. I just remember sitting there not playing and going, okay, so this is what the power of an orchestra is like.
Oh yeah, and the best shows and the most fun shows are the ones, for me anyway, are the ones with the biggest orchestras. You know, a lot of times keyboards get anecdotally referenced as something that's replacing orchestras. And we definitely do not want to replace orchestras. That is not our plan. That is not how we operate. We want to augment. We're there to augment. And so the shows that I really love are, Phantom Broadway, where they have 30 players, or we did a production of Sunset Boulevard on Broadway a couple years ago that had something like 42 players on stage with 2 keyboards. And when you have that many players, the power is unbelievable. It's really a treat.
Exactly right. And so you've just prompted me on a question, Dave. Some musicals do have some sort of sequencing, or not backing tracks, but click tracks and stuff like that.
Sure.
You're obviously having to work with that a little bit. How much would there be fully organic versus click tracks? I'm assuming it'd be 50-50 or maybe even 70-30 towards click tracks nowadays.
On a lot of shows, that's the case. But a lot of shows pride them, not just Webber shows, but everybody and the other programmers pride themselves on the live stuff, on the live element. And of course, there are going to be click tracks, whether it's a big band show like 42nd Street, where you don't have room in the pit for a 40-piece big band. Sometimes you're going to have to augment. On shows like Phantom of the Opera, when the singers are doing something dangerous on stage, there's a part of Phantom of the Opera where they're walking across a precarious bridge and they're carrying lanterns as they do it. The vocals are our backing track, and we have to make sure that we this. Now, luckily, that's not our job to deal with that. That's the sound department that handles that. But there are times when or when something has to be absolutely huge, like the beginning overture of Phantom of the Opera, and it's going, when it does that whole thing with the pipe organ, that is a combination of live and backing.
Yeah, which makes sense. Yeah. That's
little known fact, that organ part is being played by rock legend Rod Argent.
Oh, really? Yeah, because it's that real pipe organ-y sort of sound, isn't it?
He and Webber were schoolmates.
Wow.
And on the original London cast version the original London version of Cats, Rod Argent was keyboard 1 for the first 6 months, and all the Prophet 5s belonged to him. So there's this little connection that not many people know about with Rod Argent and Webber.
That is amazing. Yeah, I didn't. That's incredible. And so back to the K27. Let's use the K2700 as an example, Dave. In these musicals, what's your redundancy like? I mean, they're incredibly, like all the big brand workstations now, they're incredibly reliable machines. But do you, for a production, have to have a second one there as a backup?
We always have a spare, at least one. up until recently, we've had 3 spares, but now we've gone down to 1 spare because the reliability's there, and we can get all the files we need into one board. Up until now, it was actually a matter of memory, that the keyboards didn't have enough memory to have all 3 chairs loaded into one board, because we're talking a lot of samples, and then a lot of actual presets, a lot of programs. Each keyboard has about 600 presets that the player steps through. Every couple of bars, there'll be a sticker in the music that has a patch change, and they'll play bassoon in their left hand, harp in their right hand, and then they'll hit a patch change, and now they're playing oboe, and they hit a patch change, and now they've got timpani with a cymbal roll on their pinky finger, and bird chirping sound in their right hands for Mary Poppins or something. They're tap dancing on these pedals. They're also riding a volume pedal while they do this.
Yeah, it's certainly an incredible skill compared to just playing keyboards in a band. There's no doubt about that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And so, Dave, if you don't mind spending a couple of minutes, talk to us the rough process from the time you start a relationship with a musical, setting up the gear to, opening night. What is yours and your partner's roles there? Just if you don't mind doing a bit of a day in the life of.
Sure. Well, if it's a brand new show, there are workshops, they call them, which are just rough, low budget versions of rehearsals. And my partner does most of those for the Webber shows. My partner does those because he's in he's in the UK, and those always take place in London. And he'll be given a score, and he'll be given parts for each player. And so based on the parts, he'll start creating patches on the keyboard and patches in Mach 5. He'll show up to rehearsal at the first workshops, and they might not even have a really large orchestra at those workshops. It might be really small, but they build the orchestration. It's interesting. The orchestration, the backbone of the orchestration is the keyboard programming, and it's designed to really lift up the acoustic players. So even if you don't have a full section of winds, when you do have the one real oboe or the one real clarinet, our job is to make them shine and to kind of redirect people's attention to the live instruments and make everything else just sound big. Our job is to make a 4-piece string section sound like a 20-piece string section. So after that happens, after we do the workshops, then they start, and assuming the show gets approved and the producers get the money and it moves on, they'll start proper rehearsals with a full orchestra. And every day there are changes and additions and subtractions that have to happen in real time or almost real time. Sometimes we'll have a notebook and we'll get them on a coffee break. They'll tell us, oh, here, we want to make this louder, make this softer, change this xylophone to a marimba, change this celeste to a Glock, move it up an octave, and we have to be able to do that either on the spot or at the next coffee break when everyone takes 5 minutes to go stretch their legs.
So at that rehearsal period, Dave, either you or your partner are literally in there, hands-on, ready to jump in and yeah.
Yeah, and then we're also there to help coach the players because this isn't just playing piano. There's some types of instruments that require certain types of playing, and so we're there to gently coach the players and also help the players make the most of how they use their pedals and how to understand the rig and the technology. But I often joke with people that 90% of the time I'm using skills that I acquired when I worked in the restaurant business. When a million years ago, when I used to be a bartender, when I used to be a waiter, that a lot of my job is to convey a sense of calm and confidence and to make people feel like they're looked after, make the players feel like they're being taken care of and they're being supported, and then to make the bosses feel like everything's being taken care of. Sometimes the musical bosses might not be overly tech savvy, and sometimes keyboards on shows can be a great source of worry for management. And our job is to make it so that they never have to think about keyboards.
Which is a great outlook. And I was about to ask you that. I mean, these are top tier musicals. So what are you finding there's an increasing level of tech savviness amongst those keyboard players now, where you are really dealing with very professionally trained musicians who probably know their way around a piano incredibly well, but get them on technology and they struggle?
It used to be what you described. It used to be, and it still is sometimes, with what we'll run into older seasoned players who are a little put off by the technology, but are amazing musicians. But most of them have learned how to cope. And then when we run into the younger players coming out of conservatories nowadays, they know more than I do. They're more savvy than me. They're quite up on the technology.
So that's great. So you get them up to speed. They understand their sounds. They understand their way around the keyboards and pedals that they're using. So opening night happens. Did your role essentially cease then unless there's troubleshooting to be done, or?
Yeah, usually what happens is we'll rehearse in a rehearsal room usually on site at the theater in one of the rooms where they would have dance classes. We have one last rehearsal called Sitzprobe, where the cast comes in and the orchestra comes in and they face each other. That's the only time where the cast and the orchestra get to see each other in person, and it's a real magical experience. This thing called Sitzprobe, and it's an opera term, a German word for sit and listen, I think. But we do Sitzprobe, and then we move everything into the pit. And once everything's in the pit, then tech rehearsal starts, where you've got props and you've got automation and you've got all the lights and lighting effects and video effects. And so that goes on for about a month, or maybe 2 weeks. It depends on the show. We'll stay through that because every day they're still making changes, they're still making cuts, they're still making alterations. It just means that I'm sitting out in the audience listening, usually with one of the music bosses, and then they'll give me a list of changes, and I'll run down during a coffee break. I'll climb down into the pit and dial in my. Okay, so there's all that. Then on a big show like a West Ender or on Broadway, or Sydney, they would have a run of previews where there is a paying audience, but it's not considered opening night. They don't get reviews. And so usually on a big important show, my partner or I will stay through previews. And then when there's finally the real opening night, then we get to go home.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's really interesting what you said about the Sitzprobe too, because for those musicians, once they're in the pit, they don't get to see the stage, aside from, I understand they may have video screens and stuff like that, but still not the same. That's the only time they get to see the performers face to face.
Yeah, it's funny. During tech rehearsals, when things are happening in the theater, the actors who aren't on during a scene will try their best to come out into the audience so they get to watch what's going on and they get to hear what's going on, because they so often won't get to do that.
No, that's right. Now, look, that's absolutely amazing. I mean, I could talk about that for hours. I just find that fascinating. And so what was the learning curve for you first getting into that area of work? Like, did you know what you were in for? And again, we'll talk about sound design and programming more broadly, but did you know what you were in for when you first started in that area?
No, I got thrown into the fire. It was merciless. I went from zero theater to Evita Broadway was my first theater experience. And I was really lucky that it wasn't worse or more difficult, and it came out fine. Everything worked out fine, but it was very frightening. It was very unsettling to be thrown into that, and my partner Stuart couldn't be there, obviously, or else he wouldn't have needed to hire me. So I could text him. I could text and call and ask him about what's what, but but mostly I was on my own and had to figure it out. And I don't want to have to do that again. I had worked on big productions before. I had worked on big rock things like Bowie and Pink Floyd, but they're so different. They're so less intense than a Broadway show with 700 patch changes for 3 players. So 2,100 patch changes, that's far more overwhelming than anything I worked on a rock show.
Yeah, that is huge. And we will also talk about you as a player, because you'd nearly have to be some sort of player yourself to be able to navigate that role.
Yeah. My sight reading's not quite good enough for me to be a professional Broadway pit player, but it's certainly good enough to help program shows and walk through everything.
And so before we leave musicals, one last, it's a silly question, but your favourite musical, given that you will have had to have sat through a lot of these musicals, I'm guessing, if not dozens, hundreds of times, is there one that you'll still happily listen to from start to finish?
My favorite one to listen to is Mary Poppins.
It's a classic.
It's my dirty little secret. I love to listen to Mary Poppins. I love the orchestrations. I love everything about it. My favorite ones to work on would be Phantom, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Evita. Those 3. And then ones that I like but maybe get a little tedious to work on. Les Mis can be difficult to work on just because it's so goddamn long. It's really... There are times where, I work on the show, and there are times where I've said, oh shit, did they forget intermission tonight? And
See,
skip the interval.
I'm hearing you, Dave, and I'm ashamed to say I've only seen Les Mis once, and that was a high school production one of my children were in, so I can't claim any expertise, but even I remember that, and I'm going, gee, this is a long show.
It is Act 1 is long. Jeez.
Oh, that's funny. All
right. So it sounds amazing, and I love it, but...
Yeah, no, I understand. And look, I said I would talk for days about musicals alone, but let's move on. You just mentioned in passing your sound work with rock, so maybe we'll move to that. So tell us about how, and you mentioned, look, let's start with Bowie for starters, unless there's a better sequence you'd prefer to cover as far as artists. Tell us about how that came about.
Bowie was always my favorite artist, one of my idols, and that was my first big gig, was programming for the reality tour, which was his last big commercial tour before the end. In 2002 it was. I was still pretty new at Kurzweil. I got hired at Kurzweil in 2000. And I had a chance to work on their vintage keys, electric pianos, and some of the work I did on there, some of the musicians that I ended up working with, Bowie's drummer, Sterling Campbell, ended up liking that programming so much that he wanted it. He found me. He got in touch with me and said, hey, I would love you to program the effects for my drums. And so I took a Kurzweil had at the time an 8-channel effects unit called a KSP8, and it had a snazzy little remote control unit. It's actually the silver thing in my rack back there, the Kurzweil KSP8. I programmed that for Sterling Campbell. He said, look, come down, stay at my apartment, we'll hang out and get Indian food and listen to music and have fun. And so I went down over a series of weekends and stayed with Sterling Campbell. And yeah, we programmed up his drum set so that he would say, okay, on this one, I want my kit to sound like the Rolling Stones, Street Fighting Man. And on this kit, I want you to turn my hi-hat into a synth. And on this tune, I want to sound like I'm in a cavern. And on this tune, I want to sound like I'm in the meters. And I did my best to dial in compressors and equalizers for each of the channels. I had 8 channels to deal with, and Sterling's drum tech was amazing and very helpful guy. And somehow we got that all working. That was another one where I was kind of just thrown into the gig and had no idea how it was going to go. got very lucky.
That's amazing. And so that was that would have been quite a chunk of work. That was before the reality tour.
Yeah, it was right before it started, in 2001, 2002. And so while I was doing that, Sterling Campbell was friends with John Caron, who's the keyboardist for Roger Waters and Pink Floyd and David Gilmour. And so he ended up hitting me up for just little bits of work. Nothing, not like programming a whole show, just little odds and ends.
And
But it was nice to become friends with guys like this.
absolutely. And so that's how you got into the Roger Waters side of things.
Yeah. And then as time went on at Kurzweil, there were layoffs and shakeups, and I survived a lot of those layoffs. And I ended up becoming the public face of the company, of the research and development. And so when there were artists who reached out to Kurzweil, I was the guy they were directed to, which was really fortuitous. It was a real treat. I ended up getting to meet some amazing artists and a bunch of my heroes.
And so what are the I know it probably is hard to specify highlights, but what are some of the highlights from that time, Dave?
Oh, Earth, Wind, and Fire, getting to hang out with Myron McKinley. One that surprised me was the band Heart. I had always known they were a good rock band, and I liked them well enough. But Heart live, if you get a chance to see them, I don't know if you've seen them in any recent, they are amazing. They work their tails. They're one of the hardest working rock groups I've ever seen. And they close every show with Zeppelin covers. They're famous for doing Zeppelin covers. And so they would use my Misty Mountain Hop preset for Misty Mountain Hop. They would use my preset for No Quarter. And that was a real treat and very unexpected.
They are an amazing band, Dave, and I know it was either Anne or Nancy, or both maybe, inducted Led Zeppelin into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame from memory.
Yeah, I think it was both.
Yeah, and we've had the pleasure of having Dan Walker, who plays keys with Heart, on the show, and you're right, what he describes are an incredibly hard-working, tight, amazing band.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was friends with the people who were before him.
Yeah, so
But yeah,
that's an interesting highlight, and so let's probably, and it links in. Let's talk about your Kurzweil year. So you were with them, I think, for 13 years as an employee.
yeah, I worked at Kurzweil Research and Development for 13 years. I started out just chopping up samples all day and all night, just chopping up samples on the actual keyboard itself. And these would go into ROM expansions or CD-ROM collections that they would sell. But I eventually moved up to programming, and then programming plus product development, and planning out, interfacing with customers, getting on forums like the Keyboard Corner, and hearing from users what they wanted, and going back and fighting with the engineers to get those things implemented.
And that's really interesting. I suppose here's a chance to kill a stereotype. So one of the stereotypes, well, there are many stereotypes about Kurzweil, most of which are positive, i.e. they're incredibly robust machines with incredible sounds that well and truly outlive the life of a lot of other keyboards as far as utility. So they're the positive ones. One of the negative stereotypes is around the whole vast architecture and programming stuff. In 500 words or less, Dave, tell us why vast actually isn't that hard. And I've never tried. I don't know it at all. So for all I know, it may be easy as anything. But you do hear that around the traps that it's a little bit harder. Tell us why that's not the case.
It's a trope that kind of has become a self-fulfilling prophecy for people. If you tell yourself it's hard, it's like learning a language. If you tell yourself it's hard, and a language like Russian is supposed to be hard, it's known to be hard, and if you tackle it with that in your head, with that mindset that, oh, this is so hard, and what I've always told people, I mean, I'm not a technical guy. I don't have a technical background. I'm a liberal arts guy with a music background, and I didn't study electronics or coding or software engineering. I didn't do any of that stuff in my background and my schooling. Not telling yourself that it's hard is the first and most important step. And the second most important step is to remember that it was designed by musicians, not by engineers. There was a team of musicians at Kurzweil who told the software guys what to implement and how to implement the features. The problem is there's so many features, there's so many things we needed to do, there's so many cases that we would say, all right, well, I want to be able to do a pitch bend, but what if I only want to be able to pitch bend the notes held by my hand, but not the ones held by the sustain pedal? And we would come up with more and more usage cases, and the software guys would implement those, but it becomes harder to learn that system if you're throwing in all of these extra usage cases.
And I think that's one of the key things about that trope, as you mentioned. It is one of the reasons it is complex, is that it is so deep. I don't think anyone would argue it's not one of the deepest systems you can work with.
Yeah, and we give users enough rope to hang themselves, definitely, but there are other parts of the Kurzweil can seem daunting when I've worked on other brand manufacturer keyboards, and I go to the filter page and I get a low pass filter and I get a setting from 0 to 100, and I say, well, what the hell does 56 mean? Where on a Kurzweil, if I'm using a low pass filter, I've got hertz, and you know, if I'm dealing with levels, I have decibels. You know, if I'm dealing with pitch, I've got cents. So the Kurzweil tends to stick with audio nomenclature that's you know, if anyone who's coming from a pro audio background will feel very much at home on a Kurzweil because of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, your relationship after that 13 years has continued. So my understanding is you still consult to Kurzweil, and I know for a fact you sell them yourself. So obviously...
Yeah, I still consult for them. I still do a bit of programming for them. I made the weird transition from employee to endorsing artist, which is very strange, but nice and kind of silly, but I took it when they offered it. But yeah, and I am a Kurzweil dealer, which is, you know, we sort of a boutique dealership, and then Kurzweil warehouse acts as my back end. So again, I don't have to have any warehouse, just like with the children's books, which means I get to stay married.
Yeah, look, I was going to say 50 or 60 K2700s is a surefire recipe for divorce in a house.
Yeah. Hell, 3 or 4 would be.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's excellent. So prior to Kurzweil, Dave, so tell us, we'll now do what we usually start a show with, and that's what got you into music in the first place. Growing up, what was it that caught your imagination with all this?
Both of my parents, my mom and dad, were both music teachers and orchestra musicians. And so they got me started at a really early age. Got me started on lessons when I was 4 or 5. And by the time I was in junior high school, they got me a keyboard, an Ensoniq, my trusty Ensoniq ESQ1, which was a fabulous keyboard. It was you know, it was a cumulative birthday and Christmas for like 3 years. That was not a trivial thing for them to do.
Not at all.
But the ESQ1 was a great way for me to learn about synthesis. And then Keyboard Magazine, you know, before the internet, Keyboard Magazine was my internet. Absolutely. When it came to learning about music and music technology.
Yeah.
So I grew up with it beaten into me endlessly. By high school, I started on jazz lessons, started learning jazz harmony and improv, and then I ended up going to Berklee College of Music, and I wanted to study something non-technical because I knew the technology would always be changing, and if I majored in synthesis in 1992, that in 10 years whatever I'd learned would have been kind of obsolete. So I majored in arranging and orchestration, which ended up paying off with this Andrew Lloyd Webber thing.
Absolutely.
I never in a million years thought I would be working on Broadway. I was never a huge music theater fan. I appreciated it, but I wasn't a diehard fan. But I've been very thankful that I majored in orchestration and arranging. And then I played in bands. We played in funk and rock bands, and we were much skinnier and dressed like pimps and spacemen, and tried to to make it. Did tours up and down the East Coast, and while I did that, I waited tables and bartended. And then in 2000, I applied for a junior position at Kurzweil because they happened to be in Boston, and just by dumb luck, they had an opening.
Yeah, and that certainly changed your career trajectory.
Changed everything. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. And so we've got a handful of questions, Dave, that we ask all our guests, and we're going to start off with the good old train wreck question. So, and I can imagine with these top tier musicals across so many locations, there must have been some fun times, or even back in your days of playing in bands, touring up and down the East Coast, where something's gone really badly wrong.
The biggest disaster on a show I've ever heard of was Avita. Avita, New York. I had left to go back home. My partner Stu had arrived to take over for me. They were in the middle of previews, and one night right after a preview, a maintenance worker accidentally triggered what's called the deluge curtain. And the deluge curtain doesn't sound good, whatever it is. When they told me what it was, I said, I don't know what the hell that is, but it sounds fucking horrible. And what it is it's a pipe of water over the stage, meant in case of a fire, and it dumped out 20,000 gallons of water onto the stage and into the pit. And there was supposed to be a performance the next day. And so I got a call the next day, and my partner, Stu, said, Dave, the funny thing, we've had a bit of a flood. Would you care to come down and join us? And they had to cancel one night of previews. So the flood happened late on a Monday night. They canceled Tuesday. They spent $2 million during that 24-hour period, and they were back up and running on Wednesday with another preview.
Wow.
I've never seen such a brute force display of spending money to fix a problem.
That is incredible. I have to say that's one of the best train wreck ones. That beats collapsing extant.
When I arrived, when I got back down there to see the wreckage, all the keyboards were taken apart, lying on top of tables with giant hair dryers lying around. Because if you blow the moisture out of those keyboards, they will work again. We ended up, the insurance paid for replacement keyboards, but the flood units actually got used on the Avita Cast album.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The ones that had been totally submerged underwater. One of the biggest train wrecks I've heard of was actually not on one of my shows. It was on a show of some colleagues of mine. There is a system out there called KeyComp, and it's kind of like playing backing tracks from the keyboard. It uses like a stack of computers. It uses this massive amount of processing power, and the player, it's either one or two players, that everything they play is the full orchestration from Pro Tools coming out. And I don't like it because it does end up replacing orchestras, and that's kind of a bummer. But putting that aside, it's the gentlemen who create and curate that software are based in Germany, and at midnight they did a software update that got broadcast out to all the computers around the world using KeyComp, and there were productions in the United States where the system just shut down and was doing an OS update.
Oh, in the middle of shows, yeah.
Yeah, in the middle of a show.
Yeah, I'm sure they changed that approach to updating after that.
That was one of the times I said, "Man, I am glad that is not me."
that's, that's two impressive ones. That's incredible. Yeah, it just shows you how catastrophic some of that stuff can be. No, that's absolutely amazing. And then the other one that we quite often ask is any lessons you would pass on to other people wanting to get into this sort of area. You know, it's obviously an industry that's changed incredibly over the last 20 to 30 years. What would you advise to someone looking at getting into this industry now?
I would say learn all the things you think you're going to need. Learn the technology, learn the playing. I would say focus on the music. Learn orchestration. That's a really big thing. Learn how all the other instruments work. Not just if you're a keyboard player who wants to get into playing keys on shows, learn how wind instruments articulate. Learn how string instruments articulate. That sort of thing. And then I would also say work on communication skills. Some of the only times that have been really difficult for me with players have been players who don't know how to write a proper email, players who don't know how to speak well, or who aren't confident communicating, and that stuff is actually really important, more so than I would have ever imagined. Communication skills,
and that comes back to your, every interaction is a bit like being a waiter at a restaurant. I think
yeah.
No, I think that's an excellent lesson that we can all take on board. And just before I forget we talked about Bowie and a little bit about Roger Waters. I'd be remiss and if I didn't ask the Brian Wilson. How did that come about?
Oh, Brian Wilson, his keyboard player was and music director was playing for Heart, and I met him when he played for Heart, and got to become friends with him just because he liked some of my work. And when it came time to do the Smile album, he called me up and said, "Hey, we're thinking about sampling Brian Wilson's Tack piano. Do you have any advice on how to sample it?" And I said, "Oh God, that's kind of a drag. I don't know if you want to do that. You know what? Why don't you let me I'll make a program. I'll make a preset using the internal samples of the Kurzweil, and let me just do that and see if you like it." And so I did. I think I used a triangle sample for the actual Tack, for the and I did some detuning. There was a randomizer algorithm that I created where each time you hit the key, it'll go out of tune differently. And I put together this artificial Tack piano for Brian Wilson, and they ended up loving it. And it got used on. They actually took the real one off of the album and used the Kurzweil one.
So that's going to be a career highlight for you, Dave. Like, it doesn't get a lot better than that.
It was. Yeah, and I'm still friends with them. They're great people. They're just wonderful. The guy's name is Darian Sahanaja, and he does all the Brian Wilson stuff, but he's been involved with some other bands too.
Yeah, no, thank you. I did want to come back to that. So no, I appreciate you covering that off. And then the dreaded Desert Island Discs question, Dave. 5 albums that have really influenced you over your lifetime.
Oh, I've got it. Hang on. I have 5 albums, but a couple honorable mentions as well. David Bowie's double live album, Stage, would be the top one.
Right, yeah.
Herbie Hancock, Manchild. And that's interchangeable with Headhunters.
Yes.
It's kind of same era, same sounds, but I prefer Manchild just a little bit. Kate Bush, Never Forever.
Oh, yeah, great album. Yep.
The Fairlight, but also the nice Rhodes stuff. Her recording on Blow Away Rhodes was one of the models for some of the Kurzweil Rhodes, some of the first Kurzweil Rhodes stuff that I did. Talking Heads, Stop Making Sense, the live album. And then, Drama by Yes.
Yep, great.
Which is that's a sleeper. A lot of people would think that's sacrilege to pick as a favorite Yes album. And I do love all the others. Of course, I love Fragile and Close to the Edge and even the weird ones like Relayer. I like them all. But I think drama is so perfect, and it shows off this thing about, yes, John Anderson was a huge part of their sound, obviously, and you do miss John Anderson, but it shows what a big part of Yes's sound Chris Squire's backing vocals are, and his bass playing and his bass parts on that album are just amazing too. And then the keyboard work, Jeff Downs, I think is just about perfect on that record. But honorable mentions would be 90125 for Desert Island Records. And my other honorable mention albums would be Funkadelic, Let's Take It to the Stage, which is not a live album, ironically, but it's got Bernie Worrell and Bootsy Collins, and it's got this. It's like if Hendrix played in a badass funk band. It's so amazing. That was a life-changing album. And then my last honorable mentions would be pretty much anything that Jack White has been doing in the past 10 years.
Yeah, he's done some really interesting stuff, yeah.
Oh, yeah, and he's been creating technology and building pedals, and he has this amazing recording studio, and his sense of curating history, and he's got so many bases covered. He's just wonderful. So that would be my Desert Island.
Great picks, Dave.
Standard Desert Island list.
I think it's diverse, and but you're also a man of my era. So and it's amazing how often Headhunt. Well, not amazing. It's not surprising, really, but how often Headhunters comes up as a pick.
I saw while watching some of these videos of some of the Keyboard Chronicles, Headhunters came up a couple times, but yeah, for me it's Manchild. But they're both gems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Dave, our last series is the Quickfire 10. So these are 10 questions that we just get a quickfire response from you. And here we go. I'll hit you with them. So the first keyboard you ever owned? Well, I think we've just covered it, ESQ1.
ESQ1.
Yeah, that is amazing. That's a great first keyboard. Most important, and let's talk about musicals probably here, your most important pre-gig ritual as far as before you turn up. What do you need to have in order before you turn up to one of these jobs?
Oh gosh, the music, the music, the music, the parts.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Little bit out of your usual area, but keytars, sexy or an abomination?
Cool.
Okay, there you go. All right, very good. I think I know the answer to this one, given the musicals you work in. I can't imagine you hitting the transpose button too often. So transpose button or adjust on the fly?
As a player, I actually sometimes need the transpose button.
Yeah, that makes two of us. A favourite gig you've ever done?
We did a televised version of Jesus Christ Superstar with John Legend and Alice Cooper and Sarah Bareilles. That would have to be the favorite gig I've ever done.
And that was the NBC one, wasn't it? In 2018. Yeah. No, that's great. We'll put a link to that because that is amazing. Favorite gig you've ever attended as an audience member?
Buddy Guy and Dr. John around 1992.
Yeah, great. And going back to your time in the 90s playing in lots of bands yourselves, best thing about playing live?
The crowd reaction, the crowd. Watching people dance.
And the worst thing about playing live?
Playing to an empty room.
Actually, that's a good one. Yeah, that's true. And name one thing you'd like to see invented that would make your life as a keyboard player easier. And I'll give you an example. Our episode that's out at the moment from Jenny Conley, she came up with what was it called? The musician diaper. So you don't need to do toilet breaks in the middle of the shows.
God, all these years, and I've never asked that question. What I would like to see invented.
But you've also worked in R&D where you are coming up with stuff. So I mean, I always feel there's not a lot out there that it still needs to happen.
I've spent all these years telling people, "Oh, you can't really do that. Oh, you can't really do that. Oh, sorry, we can't really do that. It's not possible." Something that could translate a file from one platform to another platform
Actually, that's a great one.
seamlessly and instantly. Where, for example, I could take a Mach 5, a 10 gigabyte Mach 5 file with thousands of instrument samples and just throw that into a 2700, so I didn't need to bring the computer.
Yeah, actually, that's a great one. And I understand why, due to proprietary issues, but gee, I'd love to be able to get a Pro Tools session into Logic. I'm sure I'm not alone out there.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing.
No, great answer. And then, what do you do when you're not in up to your neck in programming, sound design, and all the work you do? What keeps you sane outside of music?
Oh, my little boy is 7 now. Um, Playing with him, right? We have lots of snow right now, in here in Massachusetts, and so sledding outside and and playing games with him, doing anything with him, trying to savor this time while mom and dad are still cool before he withdraws as he gets a little bit older. That's probably what I spend most of my time with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great perspective. And Dave, I did neglect, you're sitting in a beautiful studio. Give us a rundown of what your favourite keyboards are. I did neglect to ask that before. So tell us what you love that you've got right there.
Well, I've got an Arturia Mini Brute, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Here's a Wurlitzer 200, not the 200A, just the 200. There's a CP70 there,
Oh, wow.
which was John Caron used that at Live Aid
Oh, wow.
when he played with Brian Ferry, and then over on this side are my Kurzweil keyboards,
Of course,
a PC, a 2700, and then too close to show as a PC4. But other favorites of mine over the years, the Ensoniq keyboards were always, for practical stuff. The Ensoniq, the VFX, some of those were really cool. And then as a collector, I would say a Prophet 5 and a Mini Moog. Those would be, something I'd want to have.
No, that's brilliant. And just while we're on the K2700, which I've dreamt about owning for a while, but as a gigging player, and this is not a criticism because all the big workstations are the same, they're relatively hefty. Is there any, and I don't expect you to know the answer to this, but I mean, my suggestion would be I would love a K2700 equivalent of a Modi X to the Montage or a Phantom 07 to the Phantom 7. And I know it can
That's
be...
what the PC4
Yeah,
is.
and I was about to say, I know the PC, yeah.
The PC4 is very similar. It has almost the same amount of sample memory, but it's 28 pounds.
So I need to look at that.
A whole lot lighter, yeah. And it's very similar to those other to the MO.
Because I promise there's no sponsorship deals here. I know between you and I, Dave, but I've always dreamt from those times in the 80s reading keyboard magazines as my own internet all the way down here is I've always dreamt of owning a Kurzweil, and I haven't yet. So I plan on changing that in the near future. So yeah, it's so wonderful to have you on, and you've had an amazing time. And we may have to catch up in the future and do another musicals special because there's so much stuff I know we could dig down in there on even more.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. It was a treat to talk to you, man.
So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did talking to Dave. Yeah, look, as I said in the introduction, he's a font of knowledge, and I'm going to investigate my pocketbook again for buying a Kurzweil. And I said, I promise there's no sponsorship deals. It's just that was an amazing chat. So can't thank you enough for joining us as always. If you'd like to keep in touch, we do love hearing from you. But I also want to give a shout out to our gold and silver supporters. So as always, Brother Paul Brown from the Water Boys. Thank you, Brother Paul, as always. Tammy Catcher of Tammy's Musical Stew. Do search that out on Facebook and online. There's some great shows covering a range of genres and themes. Can't recommend that highly enough. and our long-standing sponsor, musicplayer.com forums, Dave and the team there. And Dave Weiser is one of the many great musicians that do hang out there on the musicplayer.com forums. It is somewhere, if you want to hang with some great musicians and learn things, that's the place to do it. And our newest sponsor, Radio Grande, which is a great YouTube channel devoted to bringing you funk and soul reimaginings of iconic songs. They've just had a new one come out in the last couple of weeks, and they've got another one on its way. There's a stable of wonderful songs there that really capture your imagination in a different way. So thank you all for your support. We'll be back again in a fortnight. As I said, always keep in touch via our Facebook page, Keyboard Chronicles, the Keyboard CHR1 on Twitter. We're on Instagram as the Keyboard Chronicles, and then good old-fashioned email, editor@keyboardchronicles.com. I will do a quick pimp for the Patreon channel. We do appreciate our Patreon supporters that I've mentioned above. For the price of a coffee a month, so $2 to $3, you can help us go from strength to strength and keep this little boat afloat and doing even more interviews. So that's at www.patreon.com/Keyboard Chronicles. So thank you all out there for listening. We do appreciate it. We appreciate all the new listeners we get each month. It's lovely to have you on board, and we'll talk again soon.
Da da da